Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Rusty, in the Office of Congregational Development, and Mandy for a great presentation. And I want to kind of pick up where she left off. She began with kind of giving us that visual, that pie chart of the Christian year, so to speak. And I want to just speak to that for a moment and pick up where she left off. And I want us to remember the roots of Lent. Of course, in the early church, there were two main feast days or celebrations. That was Epiphany and Easter, and the calendar filled in there. And you can see on that chart that Mandy showed you how they're almost mirrors of one another. There's a season of preparation, there's the celebration, and then there's the growth. Well, let's look a little deeper into how Lent came about. In the early church, and still today, it is always appropriate to baptize. We are always within the season of Easter because we are Easter people. But we've divided the calendar up into this way so that the church can reflect the life of Jesus. And the single most appropriate day, although it's always appropriate, but the most especially appropriate day to baptize is, of course, Easter Sunday. And that's what they did in the early church. Was Easter Sunday was the day of baptism, because that is the day that the community celebrated dying to the world and then rising in the victory of resurrection with Jesus. And so Lent has its roots in baptism. It is the season in which the catechumenids, or the pilgrims, or the candidates who were coming forward to be baptized were being educated, trained in what it meant and what it means to be a Christian. And so the season of preparation for baptism was Lent. And the rest of the church then said, we need to return to our baptism each year as well. Not rebaptism, but we need to return to the waters of baptism with these pilgrims. And so we need to journey with them towards their baptism. And Lent then became a time when the church would return to baptism, and it would give things up, be more intentional about almsgiving and prayer, service. And that was all in that effort to join the pilgrims as they journeyed to baptism. So I want to share this with you very quickly. I don't have a lot of slides to share with you today, but here we go. So here is a baptismal font, or I don't know. I found this morning. I think it's an old one from the early church. It could be kind of one that somebody has pieced together. It could be a reproduction, but I think it's one from the early church. But we're going to say it is for right now. You can see here on either side how there could be water flowing into this font. You can see how somebody comes into the font on one end and goes out of the font on the other end, or the pool. In the early church, on early Easter morning, the candidates, the pilgrims, would gather. In many places, they would go into a separate structure or a separate place from where the church was meeting. There was a pool. And if it were possible, many of those places, there was actually living water. There was a way that water would flow into and out of that pool. And in many of those places, there might have been a barrier down the middle of that pool, so that women could be baptized on one side and men on the other, which gives us also evidence that while there may not have been female ordination back then, there were certainly female ministers who were doing the work of baptism for those female pilgrims, because they were baptized in the nude, many of them, because as closely as possible, those mothers and fathers of the church wanted to remind these pilgrims that their baptism was new birth. And that didn't always take place, but it did take place in some places. And so, fresh from the waters of baptism, they were given a clean white robe. They were then, they processed into the church, whether it been an outdoor service or an indoor service in someone's house. And they, or some places, they had a structure of their own that they may have shared or was dedicated solely to them. And for the very first time, they stayed and they experienced the Lord's Supper for the first time. And so I think it's important. Remember that Lent, just like Advent isn't about pretending you don't know you're getting the bicycle that's hidden in the basement. And so you play act that you're excited that Jesus is born. No, during Advent, we prepare and we lean into the second coming of Jesus by celebrating his first coming. During Lent, like Mandy said, if giving up chocolate makes you closer to Jesus, then that's wonderful. But what might also be appropriate, what might also be very good, is for you to encourage your people to take something extra on. And that's difficult this year. I think the whole world has had enough. And so maybe there's a creative way to do that this year. Maybe you take something on by becoming intentionally more simple or relying more fully on God. But we take on the extra work of going with the pilgrims to baptism, of taking that journey again, and returning and recommitting ourselves to our baptismal vows. Well, enough about that. I think that for Lent 3, 4, and 5, the Gospel and the Old Testament give us a wonderful opportunity to speak a good word. And I was very excited to see that the Gospel is from John on all 3 of these Sundays, and it pairs so very well with the Old Testament lesson. And so I think I'm going to move through this quickly. If any of you want to talk about it more, have questions afterwards, I'm happy to do that. Just be in touch. And I'm not going to read these passages to you. I'll trust that you'll take some time to do that. Most of these stories anyway. We begin with Exodus 20, verses 1 through 17, which is, of course, the giving of the 10 Commandments. God is forming a community in the wilderness. He's giving his people an identity as they're moving from slavery and bondage into the promised land. God is forming his people, Israel. When we get there to this place, the mountain is scary. It's foreboding. The holiness of God threatens the people. And so they say to Moses, you go up and you have this interaction for us. And then even after that, they say, you continue to do this work of being the buffer between us and the holiness of God. Well, when we get to John's gospel, of course, the word becomes flesh and tabernacles among us. And so the holiness of God becomes contained, so to speak, in human form, not just in human form, but actually human in Jesus. And that holiness then enters into our world, and it begins the work of a new creation, which is what we celebrate in baptism. And what we will see in these readings as we move along is that wherever Jesus goes, wherever he encounters, the holiness, the new creation threatens the old creation. And John begins by telling us this in the first chapter, as John writes about light and life coming into the world and overcoming the darkness. And that's what we see during these stories. So in this first story, of course, with Jesus here in John's gospel, it is, I'm losing my notes here. It is John chapter 2, verses 13 through 22. And so let's turn there for a moment, shall we? Okay, important here. We never read the scripture that we're tackling in isolation. It's always in conversation with the other stories that are here. And so, and I'm trying to move quickly through this. Um, this story of Jesus cleansing the temple is the story that comes immediately after the wedding at Cana, right? And when I grew up, the story of wedding in Cana was just a really great story about how wonderful Jesus is and the sweetness of Jesus, and we can contemplate that all day. But as we go a little deeper, we understand that this imagery of the new wine coming in the lateness of the feast is the abundance of the kingdom that Jesus brings. And so, just like in Luke, we have Jesus going into the temple, unrolling the scroll of Isaiah and proclaiming the kingdom. That's the inauguration of his work in Luke. The inauguration of his work in John is the wedding feast. Jesus is bringing heaven and earth together. He's bringing a new creation. The new wine is flowing from the hills that we read about in the prophets. And that's what we have here in this story. So what about it? Well, the very first thing Jesus does is proclaim the abundance at the wedding of Cana, and then he marches straight to the temple. And here in this story, this is the first Passover feast that Jesus is attending in Jerusalem, and in his father's house, the temple is being gummed up by the marketplace. Understand this: the abundance of grace that we find at the beginning of chapter 2 threatens the marketplace in the second part of chapter 2. God's abundance and God's grace threatens the world's scarcity. The holiness of God threatens our sinfulness. The light of the kingdom of the new creation outshines the darkness that we see here. And so as John tells the story of Jesus the way he tells that story and his witness, this work of cleansing the temple comes at the beginning of the gospel. And we know that the life of Jesus is the beginning of the new creation. And so we as the church during Lent, as Mandy said, we enter into a time where we ask Jesus to come back into our hearts in a fresh and new way and cleanse the temple, right? To cleanse the church of all the ways that we have sunk back into the scarcity of the world and refused the abundance and the grace of God's kingdom. Well, as we move forward to the next Sunday, we're in Numbers 21, 4 through 9, and John 3, 14 through 21. And the comparison between these two stories is blatant. It's there. Numbers is the story of the snakes in the wilderness. And then in John 3, we have the story of Jesus comparing himself to Moses lifting up the serpent in the wilderness, and the people looked upon that image and they were healed. And Jesus says the Son of Man must be lifted up as the serpent was in the wilderness, so that the entire world can look upon him and be healed. Well, in Numbers, the folks are fresh from receiving the law, and Numbers chapters 11 through 25 features these episodes in the wilderness where God's people, have one heartache and trial after another. They keep wanting to return to the scarcity, if you will, of Egypt, to their slavery. And one of the ways that we can think about this is nostalgia. We always want to go back. What is the first thing you hear at any new appointment? Um, there's almost an apology from the church members in many places because they're not as good as they used to be. Because we all, and I'm not throwing stones at them, all of us do this in one way, shape, or form. We all idealize our past because we tend to weed out the sinfulness and the brokenness. And where we were, the glory of what was is better than what lies ahead of us. And so the people are grumbling. The people are complaining to Moses that you've drug us out here to die. Um, in other parts, there's one of my favorite verses from the Old Testament. I don't think it's in Numbers, but it's in another one of these stories. I think in Exodus, the people say, you know, you brought us out here to die. We don't even have graves. At least in Egypt, we knew where we could die, and we could have our fill at the flesh pots, these terrible pots of stew that the Egyptians gave their slaves. We had our fill at the flesh pots every day. Well, in this story, which is troubling, I mean, again, this is one of these ancient texts that's, you got to kind of do some work in explaining it. God sends poisonous snakes among the people and they bite them. And then he tells Moses, you know, fashion the image of a bronze serpent and lift it up on the pole, and everybody who looks at it will be healed. What's also interesting here is that the word for poison is also, could be translated the word for fiery. And so these are fiery snakes, if you will. It's seraph, and then that word is at the root of the seraphim, the angels that surround God in Isaiah's vision. When Isaiah encounters God's holiness and it is too much for him. And so the story of the snakes in the wilderness is also a story of God's holiness threatening his people as they want to sink back into scarcity and not move forward, if you will, towards the waters of baptism, towards the promised land. Well, I remember listening to one podcast and the great, one of my favorite preachers, and he said that the work of the Holy Spirit is always that it brings God's future crashing in upon the church. It's always pulling us forward into God's future. There is no time to look back. There is no time for you to set hand to plow and look back. There is no time for you to go and bury your dead. The kingdom of God is now, and it's pulling us forward into God's good future for all of creation. Well, this is of course, the conversation that Jesus has with Nicodemus in chapter 3 that we encounter on this day. And Nicodemus is being illuminated by Jesus. He's being illuminated by the light. And we, of course, get hung up at chapter 3, verse 16, because that really sounds like a wonderful formula on how you get eternal life. But this whole passage is important. And I personally think even more important than verse 16 is verse 17. For so much of John's gospel is there in that verse. God didn't send his son into the world to judge the world, but that the world might be saved through him. This is Jesus's agenda in John's gospel as he brings this new creation crashing in upon the world. And so he encounters Nicodemus and he has this conversation with Nicodemus about being born again, born anew into the kingdom. And of course, that brings us back to that imagery of baptism as well. And Nicodemus, you know, in one of those great John ways, says, I can't go back into my mother's womb and be born a second time. Jesus talks about the work of the Spirit. Jesus explains what he's talking about here with Nicodemus. And of course, again, none of these texts are separate from one another. We're always, even as we're preaching these texts, we're going to focus on them, but the text is always communicating with the other text. So Nicodemus doesn't get it, but when we turn the page to chapter 4, of course, the woman at the well in Samaria, she does get it. The longest conversation Jesus has with anybody is with the outsider, the woman at the well in Samaria. And that's the very next place. And of course, that takes us back to baptism as well. There is good news, of course, for Nicodemus as well, because he does finally get it. Jesus is the eternal king. And so even during the death of Jesus, Nicodemus comes and he lives into the kingdom there. One more word. Nicodemus is encountered encounters Jesus. Jesus doesn't coerce Nicodemus. He doesn't threaten Nicodemus. He invites Nicodemus to live into the kingdom that is here and now. Nicodemus has a hard time with that, but there's never any coercion there at all. And what Jesus is inviting Nicodemus into is the lifelong process of living into the new creation, not a program, but new life, living into the new creation. And of course, we know that living into the new creation isn't always easy. It doesn't come naturally to us each day. It's something that we must recommit ourselves to, asking grace to be there. But the good news, of course, of this text is that the light overcomes the darkness. Jesus says there are those who will hide in the darkness. But the good news for all sinners is that there's no place to hide. The light will illuminate all of the darkness. And what we will find when we bring ourselves out of the darkness and submit ourselves to the light of Jesus is that his light is able to illuminate even the darkest pieces of our lives and thus cleanse us and make us new and bring us into the new creation. This good news really is good news. The other thing that we encounter here is the shame and the humiliation that sinfulness feels in the light of the light, so to speak. And we see in Nicodemus what we see in a lot of our brothers and sisters, what we see in ourselves, and that is in the face of the abundance of God's grace, our hearts turn back. As Luther said, the heart turns in upon itself as it wants to return to the scarcity of Egypt. But Jesus is always bringing the kingdom in, crashing in upon us and calling us forward. There's also some things to do here that you should remember. You could also open up a really wonderful conversation about atonement theology and kind of the very immature notions that a lot of us share about that, calling us forth into the kingdom, into a deeper understanding of that, and not that kind of punitive theology that many of us are trapped in, but in the thought, and even in the death of Jesus, there is abundance, because the way that Jesus compares these two things. In the Old Testament, we have the story of Moses using the instrument of their death to heal them. And then Jesus expands upon that in a way where the cycle of our sinfulness is brought to an end at the cross. And Jesus says, when I am lifted up, the brokenness of the world will find healing. And that's why John keeps talking about the glorification of Jesus. The hour has come, and we'll get to this in the next gospel lesson. The hour has come that I will be glorified, and that's his crucifixion, because by his death he absorbs our death and overcomes our death. He defeats death by his death. His death is stronger than the kingdom of sin and death that has sway over us. And that's the truly good news that Jesus starts proclaiming at the very beginning of this gospel we call John. Well, finally, we get to Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34, and John chapter 12, verses 20 through 33. And this part of Jeremiah we call the book of consolation. Jeremiah writes about God's going to write a new law upon our hearts. And he talks about a reimagined kingdom and people and city. Interesting to note here that in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, heart is not the seat of emotion like we tend to think. So, when we get to the Great Thanksgiving and the Sursum Corda, and we say, we lift up our hearts to God. It's not that we're lifting up kind of our emotional selves, but in the Hebrew sense, what we're doing is we're lifting up all of who we are. For in the Old Testament, the heart is the center of intellect, ethics, morality, and it is the throne of God in our lives. God sits enthroned upon the hearts of his people, and that's where he rules. Well, this word from Jeremiah is also to the people in exile, isn't it? And so they are separated from the temple. And so even here in the Old Testament, right? The Monday morning quarterback version is the, Old Testament bad, good, New Testament good. The God we see in Jesus, just a lovely, wonderful fella. And the God of the Old Testament, well, he just likes to be judgmental and smote and smite and throw lightning bolts and things like that. Well, that's not fair, and it's not accurate, and it's not a good reading, and it doesn't reflect people who are being drawn deeper into the love and mercy of the God we see in Jesus. Because the God we see in Jesus is the same God who speaks through the prophet Jeremiah. And so in this text, Jeremiah is proclaiming reconciliation, forgiveness, recreation, a new day to the people in exile. And so the good news of the gospel is at work even before we meet Jesus in the New Testament. And God is at work writing his law upon the hearts of the people and forming his people into a community of holiness, even in the wilderness. God is forming his people into his temple even now. And so we see echoes here of our conversation from the previous week that we had with our folk when we talk about Nicodemus and Jesus. And what we also see here is that covenant doesn't change, right? One of the classic definitions of God's righteousness is God's fierce fidelity to covenant. The covenant doesn't change. But in God's loyalty to his covenant to love his people, God pursues us wherever we are. And so while the covenant doesn't change, God adapts to find his people in their brokenness anywhere. And so in this John text, we're back in Jerusalem with Jesus at the third Passover. It's almost time for crucifixion, and Jesus starts to talk about the kingdom in new ways. And so this is John, I've lost my notes here. John chapter 12, verses 20. So we're almost here in Jerusalem with Jesus. Jesus, in this text, there's some Greek-speaking folk who come looking for Jesus, right? And they say, we want to see Jesus. And if you look at John 12, 9, got to find it here, verse 19. What do these folks say? Therefore, the Pharisees said to each other, see, you've accomplished nothing. Look, the world is following him. The old kingdom, right? The kingdom of scarcity is threatened by the kingdom of abundance that the new creation brings. And they are resentful that the whole world is coming to Jesus. So in verse 20, where it says, some Greeks were among those who had come to worship at the festival. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and made a request, sir, we want to see Jesus. And they told him where they could find Jesus. Now, when they find Jesus, Jesus replied, the time has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. I assure you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it only can be a single seed. But if it dies, it bears much fruit, just like what Mandy said. And going into Holy Week, I'm sure what Jonathan will help us to understand and unpack. Jesus repeats his command for us to follow him. And what living into the abundance of the kingdom means is dying to ourselves, dying to the world and its scarcity, and trusting Jesus to lead us into that new creation. And so Jesus says that the hour of my glorification is the hour that I defeat the world forever. Jesus also says that this is the hour of judgment for the world, which this is, and I'm going to move quickly here to get to the end of this. This is so crucial to understanding John's gospel. Jesus keeps talking about the hour of his glory and the time of judgment. And we equate that judgment being something harsh and, back to that Old Testament God who, our unfaithful reading tells us is not a good guy. But when we get down to it, the hour of Jesus's glory, his crucifixion, is the hour of the judgment for the world. And what we see here is that, as Will Campbell says, the world is acquitted on the grounds of crucifixion, of God's grace. That Jesus is able to defeat the world at the hour of his enthronement, at the hour of his glorification, and that because of that, Jesus acquits the world. Because it's only through that grace, it's only through the overcoming of the darkness that Jesus brings us into the eternal light of his kingdom. And this is not something we do. All right, this is not Gnosticism. This is not, kind of unpacking the magic and the things like that. But this is all God's grace pointed at God's people, where in Jesus we see the beginning of a new creation. And Jesus invites us to join him there. And so I hope this has been helpful. And I'm happy to answer questions or to speak further down the road with anybody who would like to do that. And again, just appreciate so much the chance to do this and the chance to go through another Lent and to figuratively and literally this year go back and join whoever is going to be baptized and go back to the waters of baptism and find that even as I have gone back to Egypt, God is still calling me out of my tomb and into the resurrection life. God bless you. Thank you all.